After 5 years of living in the same city, Lena realized she had never really seen it. Not until she started walking home with Mark every evening after work. Because before him, her days were measured only by schedules and tasks, by deadlines and screens. But with him, time began to stretch in unfamiliar ways, slower, softer, filled with pauses that did not need to be explained. And during those walks, they rarely talked about anything important. Not careers, not plans, not fears. They spoke about small things, about a cafe they passed but never entered, about a stray cat that always waited near the bookstore, about how the light in certain streets felt warmer than in others. And gradually, Lena noticed that what she looked forward to was not the destination, not even the conversations, but the simple fact of being accompanied, of not moving through space alone. And this frightened her a little, because she had spent years building a version of herself that did not rely on anyone, that believed independence was safety, that emotional distance was strength. And yet here she was, adjusting her pace unconsciously to match his, delaying her steps when she sensed the walk was ending, inventing reasons to extend the route. And one evening, without any dramatic moment or confession, she understood that love did not arrive as a thunderstorm or a revelation. It arrived as repetition, as presence, as the quiet realization that another person had become part of the way she experienced ordinary reality. And this did not feel like losing herself. It felt like discovering a softer version of who she could be. Someone who no longer measured life only by efficiency or control, but by shared silence, by familiar footsteps, by the comfort of knowing that some connections do not demand intensity, they simply ask to be continued. As the weeks passed, Lena began to notice subtle changes in her emotional landscape. Not dramatic shifts, but quiet internal adjustments, like how she started saving small observations specifically to share with Mark later, or how certain places in the city acquired meaning only because she had experienced them with him. And this awareness unsettled her, because it revealed that her inner world was slowly reorganizing itself around another presence, and she reflected on how intimacy often grows not through grand gestures, but through accumulation, through repeated exposure to the same person in ordinary contexts. And she realized that what made their connection feel real was precisely its lack of urgency, the absence of pressure to define or label what they were, allowing affection to exist without being forced into a narrative. And yet, beneath this calm surface, she felt a quiet vulnerability emerging, because caring without guarantees meant accepting uncertainty, the possibility of loss, the risk of becoming emotionally visible. And for someone who had built her identity around control and self-sufficiency, this felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, where the comfort of connection coexisted with the fear of dependence. And in this emotional tension, Lena began to understand that love is not about certainty or permanence, but about the willingness to remain open even when the outcome cannot be predicted, to allow another person to influence your perception of reality, and to accept that meaningful experiences are always accompanied by the risk of pain. And yet, despite this awareness, she found herself choosing the walks, the conversations, the shared silences, because something in her recognized that emotional safety does not come from isolation, but from the courage to be present with another person in imperfect, unpredictable ways. One evening, as rain began to fall unexpectedly, Lena and Mark took shelter under the narrow roof of a closed shop, standing closer than usual, listening to the distant sound of cars and the soft rhythm of water against concrete. And in this compressed space, Lena became acutely aware of small details she had previously ignored: the warmth of his jacket, the way his breathing slowed when he spoke, the quiet patience in his posture. And this heightened awareness created a subtle emotional intensity, not driven by desire, but by presence, by the simple fact of sharing a moment that did not belong to anyone else. And she realized that intimacy often reveals itself in these unplanned pauses, where nothing needs to happen for something meaningful to be felt. And as they waited for the rain to ease, she sensed a shift in herself, a recognition that her emotional boundaries were softening, that she was no longer observing the connection from a safe distance, but participating fully, allowing herself to feel without immediate analysis or protection. And this surrender felt both liberating and unsettling, because it required trust without evidence, acceptance without certainty. And she understood that love does not announce itself. It emerges quietly through accumulated moments where two people choose to remain instead of leaving, to listen instead of withdrawing, to share silence instead of filling it. And in that small, sheltered space, surrounded by rain and unfamiliar stillness, Lena felt something settle within her, a sense that whatever this connection was becoming, it was already reshaping her inner world in ways she could no longer control, and perhaps no longer wanted to. After that evening, Lena found herself replaying the moment more often than she expected. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because of what had not happened. The absence of tension, the lack of performance, the way nothing needed to be said for the connection to feel real. And this disturbed her usual understanding of relationships, because she had always believed that intimacy required intensity, emotional confession, or visible effort. Yet with Mark, closeness was emerging through quiet continuity, through shared time that did not demand explanation. And she began to question how many of her previous relationships had been built on urgency rather than understanding, on the desire to be seen rather than the willingness to see another person. And this reflection made her aware of how rarely she allowed herself to simply exist with someone without trying to manage the outcome, without shaping the narrative in advance. And as she walked alone through the city one night, passing the same streets they usually shared, she felt the absence of his presence not as loneliness, but as a subtle emotional echo, a recognition that certain experiences had already been transformed by connection, that space itself had become relational, carrying traces of shared attention. And in this realization, she understood that love is not something that arrives from the outside. It grows internally first, reshaping perception before it ever becomes visible, altering how one experiences time, memory, and even solitude. And this internal shift felt irreversible, because it meant that even if the relationship never progressed, even if nothing more ever happened, her way of inhabiting the world had already changed, and she could no longer return to the version of herself who walked through life untouched by another person's presence. As their connection deepened, Lena became increasingly aware of how much emotional energy she had once spent on self-protection, on maintaining distance, on interpreting every interaction through the lens of potential disappointment. And with Mark, this habitual vigilance began to soften, not because she suddenly trusted easily, but because the relationship itself did not demand constant evaluation. And this absence of emotional pressure felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting, because she had learned to associate love with uncertainty, intensity, and emotional risk. Yet here, affection was unfolding quietly, without dramatic highs or lows, and this forced her to confront an uncomfortable realization that much of her past emotional struggle came not from relationships themselves, but from her resistance to vulnerability, from the belief that control equaled safety. And as she observed herself laughing more easily, sharing small details of her day without filtering, and feeling less urgency to define what they were, she sensed that her identity was shifting subtly, becoming less defensive, less isolated, more open to being influenced by another presence. And this openness felt both liberating and frightening, because it meant accepting that her emotional world was no longer entirely her own, that another person now occupied space within her thoughts, her memories, her expectations. And in this acceptance, she realized that intimacy is not about merging identities, but about allowing someone else to coexist within your internal landscape, shaping perception without erasing individuality. And this understanding marked a quiet turning point, because it meant she was no longer protecting herself from love. She was learning how to remain present within it. Over time, Lena began to notice that her feelings for Mark were no longer something she actively analyzed, but something that simply existed in the background of her daily life, like a familiar melody she no longer needed to consciously hear in order to feel its presence. And this shift felt significant because it meant the connection had moved from awareness into integration, becoming part of her emotional baseline rather than a separate experience. And she reflected on how rare this form of intimacy was, how most relationships either burned intensely and faded or remained superficial and distant, while this one existed in a quiet middle space, stable without being stagnant, alive without being overwhelming. And she realized over time, Lena began to notice that her feelings for Mark were no longer something she actively analyzed, but something that simply existed in the background of her daily life, like a familiar melody she no longer needed to consciously hear in order to feel its presence. And this shift felt significant because it meant the connection had moved from awareness into integration, becoming part of her emotional baseline rather than a separate experience. And she reflected on how rare this form of intimacy was, how most relationships either burned intensely and faded or remained superficial and distant, while this one existed in a quiet middle space, stable without being stagnant, alive without being overwhelming. And she realized that what made it feel meaningful was precisely its ordinariness, the way it did not compete with life, but blended into it, enhancing everyday moments without demanding constant attention. And this understanding reshaped her definition of romance, because she no longer associated it with grand gestures or emotional declarations, but with continuity, with choosing the same person repeatedly in small, almost invisible ways. And as she watched Mark one afternoon, sitting beside her in silence, focused on something unimportant, she felt a deep, calm affection that required no justification. And in that moment, she understood that love is not always something that transforms reality dramatically. Sometimes it simply softens it, making existence feel less solitary, less rigid, more permeable to warmth and shared presence. One night, as Lena lay awake listening to the distant sounds of the city through an open window, she realized that the thought of losing Mark now carried a different emotional weight than it once would have, not as fear or anxiety, but as a quiet sadness that existed without urgency. And this realization made her aware of how deeply the connection had integrated into her sense of stability, because it was no longer defined by excitement or novelty, but by emotional grounding, by the simple knowledge that someone existed who understood her rhythms, her silences, her way of being in the world. And she reflected on how love often reveals itself not through desire, but through attachment to emotional continuity, through the comfort of shared existence rather than the thrill of discovery. And this awareness felt profound because it suggested that intimacy is not about intensity, but about emotional resonance, about the way another person becomes part of your internal sense of home. And she understood that even if circumstances changed, even if the relationship ended, the experience itself had already altered her permanently, teaching her that connection can be gentle, slow, and sustainable, and that emotional fulfillment does not require constant stimulation, only presence, consistency, and the willingness to remain open over time. And in this quiet reflection, Lena felt both vulnerable and grateful, because she recognized that the most meaningful relationships are not those that demand attention, but those that quietly reshape the way we experience solitude, time, and ourselves. As the seasons shifted and the city slowly changed its colors, Lena began to understand that what she felt for Mark was no longer something she needed to define or even question. It had moved beyond explanation and settled into something more subtle, more internal, like a quiet layer beneath her thoughts, influencing the way she perceived everyday life. And she noticed that even when they were apart, her sense of time had altered. Moments felt less empty, less rushed, as if the mere knowledge of his existence created a background sense of connection that softened solitude itself. And this realization made her reflect on how love is not always about interaction, not always about shared experiences, but about how another person becomes integrated into your inner continuity, shaping your emotional atmosphere, even in absence. And she recognized that this form of attachment was not dramatic or intense, but deeply stable, because it did not depend on constant validation or proximity, only on the quiet awareness that someone existed who had become part of her emotional reference point. And this understanding changed her relationship with uncertainty because she no longer needed guarantees or promises. She felt grounded simply by the experience of having shared something real, something slow, something that unfolded naturally without being forced. And in this emotional maturity, Lena sensed that she had crossed an invisible threshold from seeking love as an event into living it as a condition. Not something that happened to her, but something she carried within herself, shaping the way she related to time, memory, and the presence of others. And in this quiet transformation, she realized that the deepest form of romance is not found in beginnings or endings, but in the gentle, sustained alteration of how one exists in the world once another person has truly been allowed inside. One evening, as Lena and Mark walked the familiar route home for what felt like the 100th time, she became aware that nothing about the moment was special in any visible way. No rain, no dramatic light, no important conversation, only the steady rhythm of their footsteps and the quiet hum of the city around them. And yet, she felt a deep internal certainty that this ordinariness was precisely what made the connection real, because it no longer needed exceptional circumstances to feel meaningful. And in this realization, she understood that love had quietly transformed from something she experienced into something she inhabited, a space of emotional continuity where presence replaced expectation. And as they reached the corner where they usually parted ways, she did not feel the familiar hesitation or the desire to prolong the moment. She felt calm, grounded, aware that connection did not depend on extending time, only on trusting it. And in this emotional clarity, Lena recognized that romance is not defined by intensity or narrative, but by the way another person becomes woven into your sense of reality, altering how you experience silence, repetition, and even yourself. And this integration felt irreversible because it meant that regardless of what the future held, she would carry this way of loving forward, not as memory, but as a new emotional baseline, a quieter, deeper way of being present with others. And in that simple walk, with no confessions or promises, Lena understood that the most enduring form of love does not demand attention, it simply remains.